Hello, friends, and welcome back to Stories About Entitled People. Let's start our video with a crazy trip to a mid-sized tech company where a new HR policy caused chaos and led to an unforgettable showdown. But before we dive in, make sure to hit that subscribe button, smash the like if you enjoy the content, and ring that notification bell so you never miss a juicy story. Suspended for being a minute late? Fine. Enjoy handling the biggest project without me. So I'm Mark, and for the past 5 years, I've been working at this mid-sized tech company. It's been great. Or at least it was until 6 months ago when we got a new HR manager, Susan. Now, Susan's the kind of person who loves rules a bit too much. She came in with this idea to revolutionize the workplace, but all she did was implement a bunch of unnecessary and strict policies. The one that really got under everyone's skin was her new attendance policy. It stated that if anyone was even a minute late more than 3 times in a month, they'd face immediate suspension without pay. No excuses, no exceptions. This was crazy, considering we're all seasoned professionals, not school kids. But Susan was adamant, and the policy was enforced to the letter. Now, I'm usually very punctual, but life happens, right? Just my luck, I ended up being late 3 times in 1 month. The first was because of a massive traffic jam, the second was due to a power outage that killed my alarm, and the third, well, I overslept. Each time I was barely 5 minutes late, but Susan didn't care. She slapped me with a suspension notice. I was fuming. But then I remembered something important, our employee handbook. I'd read that thing cover to cover when I first started, and something about the suspension policy stood out to me. I dug up my copy and found the section I was looking for. The policy stated that suspended employees must leave company premises immediately and are not allowed to engage in any work-related activities during their suspension. A plan started to form in my head. You see, at that time, I was in the middle of a critical project for a major client. It was a huge deal for the company, and I was the lead developer. Without me, the project would grind to a halt, so I decided to follow Susan's policy to the letter. The next day, I walked into Susan's office and handed her the suspension notice along with a printed copy of the employee handbook suspension policy. I told her, as per the company policy, I will be leaving the premises immediately and will not partake in any work-related activities during my suspension, including the Johnson project. The color drained from her face. "You can't just leave the Johnson project," she exclaimed. But I just shrugged and said, "Company policy, Susan. I'm sure you wouldn't want me to break the rules." I gathered my things and left the office. The fallout was immediate. The project team was in disarray without me, and the client was getting antsy about the missed deadlines. The CEO himself called me 2 days into my suspension, begging me to come back. I explained that I was merely following company policy as enforced by Susan. Long story short, the CEO had to intervene, my suspension was lifted, and I was back to work the next day. The best part? Susan's ridiculous policies were all reviewed and mostly scrapped. She's still with the company, but let's just say her enthusiasm for rulemaking has significantly diminished. So there you have it, folks. Sometimes following the rules a little too closely can be the best form of rebellion. And always, always know your employee handbook. Some managers are far too rigid. No exceptions? What was OP supposed to do? Fly over the traffic jam? Become the power company? A suspension for 5 minutes? Ridiculous. And our next story. My aunt stole my inheritance, then karma struck and her life fell apart. My aunt was one of 2 kids my grandparents had. My mother was the polar opposite of my aunt. She worked from the age of 12 in my grandfather's shop, never asked for anything, and eventually managed to start her own business. My aunt never held down a job till the age of 26, was constantly stealing from her parents, and was constantly in trouble. Despite this, my aunt was spoiled by my grandmother, and so were her kids. She had 3 kids from 3 different men, and her first husband was not one of them, if you know what I mean. Didn't matter what my aunt or her kids did, my grandmother would always jump to their defense. She never had time for my mom and her kids unless it was to get something from us. The only reason my mom would visit her was because she loved my grandfather. My grandfather passed away in 2004, and a few months after, my nan decided to write up a new will. My mother and my aunt were both present for it when she signed it, so they knew what was in it. It made it so that when she passed away, her home would be sold and the money split 25% each to my mom and aunt, and the remaining 50% would go evenly to the grandkids. At the time, the home was worth more than £500,000, so it would be a nice little inheritance, but nothing life-changing. In 2010, my mom died after an accident and did not have a current will in place. As she no longer had her business and was renting a house, she didn't have anything of much monetary value. The only thing she was concerned about was what would be done at her funeral should she have passed away, but it told me everything she wanted. The music, the flowers, the coffin color, and even what people were to wear at the funeral. She wanted people to wear bright, warm colors. So when she passed, my aunt and Nan took over all the arrangements and tried to undo all the things I told them. The songs were going to be songs I knew Mom didn't like, the flowers were all the wrong colors, and they picked a hideous coffin. With the help of my siblings, we were able to change a few of the things back to what they were supposed to be, but the coffin couldn't be changed for some reason, and my Nan refused to let people come dressed as clowns, so it was all black. It was frustrating. After the funeral, my Nan had her will changed. My siblings and I were told by our aunt that she didn't have any involvement with the writing of the will, and our Nan told us that she changed it so that Mom's share would go to her kids instead. All good, we thought. After Mom passed away, my Nan just stopped talking about my mom. At first, we thought it was because she was still recovering from losing her daughter, but even 5 years after Mom passed, she still wouldn't talk about her. Even if you brought up a story about Mom, Nan would very obviously try and change the subject, usually about how hard my aunt and her crappy kids had it. And if you went to talk to her about your own problems, she would somehow bring it back to my aunt. I'd suffered a mental breakdown after my mom's death, so you can imagine how much it hurt to hear, well, X has had it so much worse. In 2016, my Nan passed away. She'd written down what she wanted to be done for her funeral, and it was basically all the same things she'd picked out for my mom's funeral, even the music to be played. I don't know why she tried to have a dress rehearsal funeral using my mom as the stand-in, but it was obvious that's what she was trying to do. So after a couple of months, our siblings and I were waiting to hear about the will reading, and my aunt kept telling me, oh, it'll be another month before we can do the reading. I didn't mind. I wasn't fussed about the money, to be honest, but my oldest brother was hoping to use the money to pay for a honeymoon for him and his then-fiancée, and my younger brother was about to start uni, so it would be a hell of a help. Eventually, my dad bumped into the solicitor my grandmother had used to deal with her will and asked what was happening. The solicitor let slip that the will had already been read and that it left everything to my aunt. When my dad questioned this, the solicitor told him that my aunt had been present when the will was written, despite promising that she had nothing to do with it. When confronted, my aunt initially tried to deny, but eventually admitted to lying to all of us. She showed us the will and it confirmed what we already knew. The house and all its contents were now my aunt's. This included my granddad's war medals. He fought in the Second World War. When I told her that he had promised them to me before he died, she said, well, unless you have it in writing, you will have nothing in this house. Anyway, I already gave them to Clive. My heart sank. Clive, not his real name obviously, was her eldest son and the dictionary definition of an F-up. He'd been in and out of prison for stealing and dealing drugs. I knew that the moment that jerk got his hands on my granddad's medals, they would have been sold off. We looked into taking her to court over the will, but everyone we spoke to said we probably wouldn't get anything out of it. She immediately put the house up for sale at close to £750,000. She'd pissed off too many people in our town, so she was going to sell the house and move closer to her daughter, who lives in a big city. An offer was made on the house, and she put down a deposit on a house near the big city, and I thought that was that. Here's where karma comes into play. The people who wanted my Nan's house had a survey done on the house to see if there were issues, and oh boy, were there. Turns out that the land the house was built on was way too soft for the type of house it was, and it was sinking. It has sunk about 2 centimeters in the 40-plus years my Nan and Granddad had lived there, but the sinking was accelerating to 1 centimeter per year. This meant that within the next 3 years, the house would need some serious work or be knocked down. The new value of the house? £60,000. The buyers immediately pulled out, having not even put down a deposit. She couldn't buy her new house, but still had to pay the deposit on it. And while this was happening, she let Clive move in with her into her house that she rented from the council. He wasn't allowed to live in any of the council houses because he'd trashed every single one he'd ever been given. Someone reported this, and she was kicked out of her home. She was forced to move into my Nan's old home as she couldn't live anywhere else. So there she is, living in a crumbling house with her craphead son and her partner. She was stuck there for 2 years. Every time I saw her, she'd try and start talking to me, and I would just ignore her and walk off. One time, as I was walking away, she screamed, "Your mother deserved to die for having a R-word like you," in the middle of a busy street. Someone reported her to the police, and she had an official warning from them and was ridiculed on Facebook. Every time I saw her after that, she looked more and more miserable. Eventually, she sold the house for something like £85,000 and moved in with her daughter in the big city. I lost contact with her and her kids after this. I thought karma had been issued. Oh, but karma still wasn't done with her. I bumped into one of her former friends, and she told me what happened after she left our town. She moved into her daughter's home, let's call her Sue, but they only had a 3-bedroom house and 3 kids. My aunt and her partner had to live in the smallest room in the house while my aunt looked for a job and a home to rent. Even with £85,000, she couldn't afford a home anywhere. After about a month, my aunt's partner ran off after emptying their account. She was left stranded in Sue's house, not contributing anything because all the money she makes goes into bingo. Eventually, Sue and my aunt get into a screaming match, and my aunt said something along the lines of, "I should have aborted you." Sue immediately kicked her out of her house. So again, there's my aunt in a city where she knows nobody, no money, no home, and the last bridge she had a smoldering wreck. Last anyone has heard, she was living in a caravan in the roughest part of the city, and she can no longer work because she's suffering early onset arthritis and can no longer move her hands. I know I shouldn't get joy out of something like this happening to another person, but it does bring me some peace as to what happened. I think it was well deserved. Good on you, Sue, for standing up for herself, kicking out her mother for saying something so awful. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.